Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and get started tonight. Heavenly Father, again, we come together. You have for us tonight. I pray you'll anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to say those. Thank you in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we're in the middle of Samson. So last week Samson was born, and so tonight we're going to look at Samson's first foray from home, and it's an interesting one. I think you'll find some things tonight about Samson that you may have missed earlier. So we're going to be reading from Judges chapter 14, beginning with verse 1. Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore, get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all my people, that you should go get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. Notice verse 4. But his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines were over Israel. So we find Samson now is growing up. He's a young man, and he's reached that age when he thinks he needs to get married. Well, come to that mature age. And he spotted a woman down in Timnah that attracted him. Now, Timnah was about 3 miles southwest of Zorah, where he was born and lived. Now, what was he doing in a Philistine city or a Philistine town? But I think we'll find as we go through this that just because they were Philistines and Jews or Hebrews didn't mean that they didn't get along. They evidently got along very well in this particular part of the country. And we, with being in Israel last year, we saw that very same thing. There were towns where the Palestinians and the Jews were getting along just fine. They had businesses and they were all just socializing, and there didn't seem to be any trouble. And probably the same kind of situation here. The Philistines as a whole were oppressive to the Israelites. But there were those areas where the towns were close together, and they tend to get along. Now also, where Samson lived was in the buffer zone between what was considered Israel and what was considered Philistine territory. And it was kind of a hilly area. And this, even today, is one of the buffers that they recognize between Israel and today it's the West Bank, or it's that same area. They're still recognizing that today. And so it would not be unusual for him to go 3 miles over to the other town to visit. And evidently he was over there on something, no telling what he was doing, and he saw this woman. And this woman pleased him. Now, we're going to find out that our English, when we translate this, it seems like, oh, this is the woman I want. Wow, this is the one I want. That kind of approach. But really, it wasn't. And we're going to find that from the Hebrew words and the actual meaning of these words when we get down in a couple of minutes here. So he came back, and he told his father to make the necessary arrangements. Now, we also look at this and say, well, Samson was really demanding. Hey, get that woman for me. like he was a spoiled brat. Actually, in those days, that was the way it was done. When you found somebody that you wanted to marry, you came back to your father and you said, "Father, I want you to go buy that woman for me." That was the way it was done. It wasn't negotiate a price for the woman. It was a negotiated marriage. They still do this in parts of the world, India especially. In the news, you see it every once in a while. You know, they have these weddings. Most of them are arranged. Sometimes they don't even see each other until they come together, get married. Hey, that's it. And that's the way it was then. Now, also, you need to understand that when they went and negotiated, that the father of the groom had to pay the father of the bride a dowry. And they would agree on what that might be. Once it was agreed on, the father and the son went home. The daughter stayed with her father, and they worked out and paid for this dowry. And at the same time, the son was supposed to be putting together a place for them to live. So this time between when they were actually engaged, now also you need to understand, once they were engaged, that was his wife. Even though they hadn't done anything, or been together, that was his wife. That meant that she was legally his wife. And so this is going to be important in a minute. So what Samson said is, go down and buy this woman. Go down, do the dowry, do the negotiations, and that's the one I want. Now, we also may get the impression, remember Samson was a Nazirite, that this would have been against the law. But actually, it was not. There were 7 nations that God specifically said Israel was not to marry into. The Philistines were not one of them. You find this in Deuteronomy chapter 7. It was the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Happatites, and the Jebusites. They were the ones they could not marry by law. All the rest of them, it was legal to marry them. Now there were some warnings that God gave, and I don't, but on occasion he said, don't marry the daughters of the Philistines or the uncircumcised ones, because they're going to cause you trouble in the end. See, it wasn't a forbidding, it was a warning. And it's what we do today, isn't it? Like our kids. We say, don't do that, because at the end it's going to cost you. And that's what God was, a warning that God put out. So Samson going and looking for a woman amongst the Philistines was lawful, even though he was a Nazirite. All right. Now, Samson's parents wanted him to marry a woman from their own tribe instead of from the nation that was uncircumcised and therefore not separated to God. When they said that was an uncircumcised, that meant because circumcision was a sign of separation. And they were not separated. They were orderly. They were not separated from the world. And so they raised this boy to be a Nazirite, to be separate from the world, and here he wants to go marry a woman that's in the world. And that, they didn't like that. As any parent would probably have the same reactions. Can't you find somebody from our own nation? You have to go after somebody in the Philistines. Notice what Samson said to them. He told them, go get her for me, for she pleases me well. We look at that and think physical. Beautiful girl. Wow, this is the one I want. But actually, the phrasing in there, that phrasing and those words actually means, instead of pleases me well, it literally means she is right in mine eyes. Now there's a big difference between she pleases me and she's right in my eyes. What made her right in the eyes of Samson? Well, as we're going to go through this, we're going to find out is that she was perfect to serve his purpose. You know, we look at this and say, this young guy, you know, he's just out there ready to, you know, romp and go. Actually, Samson had a purpose in what he was doing. Remember, he was a Nazirite. The Spirit of the Lord had been on him already. He knew what his purpose was. He knew what God wanted him to do. And he had a plan. And we'll see that as we begin to look at it from this different perspective about Samson. This was the first step in his plan. You remember when Manoah's wife, and Manoah and his wife were told that they were going to have a son, what did God say he was going to do? Said he was going to begin to deliver Israel.
Right. From the Philip, yeah.
And I'm sure that was told to Samson as he was raised a Nazirite, separated. I'm sure they said, Samson, you can't be like the other kids because God has called you to begin to deliver Israel. Okay, he reaches an age, he's a man now. And by the way, from the looks of things here, he wasn't a little puny guy like David. David was a little guy. Samson had to be a really big guy. How do I know that? Because we're going to find next week, I think, that he carries the gates of the city.
Yeah.
I don't care how strong you are, if you can't get your arms out there to get a hold of the gates, you're not going to carry them anywhere. He just picked them off and carried them through himself. He had to be a big man, not only supernaturally strong. Right? So, he had a plan. Now, Samson's parents did not realize that it was his purpose, and he was looking for an occasion to defeat the Philistines. He was living in a peaceful place. There was no problem in that area. How was he ever going to defeat the Philistines if everything was just wonderful and peaceful? How was that ever going to happen? He had to do something that would cause enough conflict that he could begin to deliver Israel.
Yeah.
Okay, so notice what it says here. His father and mother did not know that it was the Lord, that it was of the Lord. You see, God was talking to Samson. You say, how do I know that? Well, when you see how this all unfolds, you begin to see the plan could not have been devised by Samson. It was a divine plan, and Samson understood that plan. And so he went and he was looking for a woman that would meet the needs of his plan, and he found one. The perfect one that he needed to use to get conflict. You know, that kind of rubs us the wrong way sometimes. We look at it and say, conflict, the church is supposed to be peaceful. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. You know, we're supposed to be meek. We're not supposed to be looking for conflict. Well, I beg to differ. We're supposed to be meek among men. But when it comes to spiritual warfare, we should be looking for every opportunity to create conflict. Because what happens, we fall into this idea that everything is peaceful, so it's fine. Don't rock the cradle. Don't make anything that will disrupt what's going on. And we see that in the world today, don't we? The church goes along with the world. The world says, oh, well, you know, it's okay to be homosexual, we accept you. And what does the church do? Oh, yeah, they act like they have to knock each other down to be the first one, other churches I'm talking about, denominational churches, they'd almost knock each other to be the first ones to say, yeah, we'll accept you into our congregation. You can even pastor. Right? Yeah. You see, even the worst things in the world, the church is ready to get a hold of them. Why? Well, we want things peaceful. I mean, if we come out and talk against homosexuality, we're just bigots. We're terrible. We're anti-something.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm anti. Me, I'm anti everything in the world, just about. Why? I want to stir things up. We need to be able to recognize the enemy. Be ready to go against the enemy. Not coddle each other. Oh, it's all fine and dandy. God knew this. All right, so he spots the gal. He wants his father to go get him. Now we move down to verse 5 through 7. So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. Now to his surprise, a young lion came roaring against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat. And he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. All right, so here he's talked his dad into it, so they head off to Timnah. And Samson, of course, is going to point the woman out to his father so they can start the negotiations. And somewhere along the line, along the way, when they got to the vineyards of Timnah, which probably means that it was just an open area full of vineyards and, you know, wild bushes and you know, well, I shouldn't say bushes. It was, you know how grapes are. If you've been around grapes, I mean, they're huge. You know, they can get up so high and they're just full of grapes. This was a harvest season. So they got to this place, and for some reason, Samson left his father and mother. Now, I don't know why. He maybe went into the vineyard for some reason. I don't know. But he ended up by himself. And suddenly, to his surprise, here comes a young lion. Now, Samson, you know, he was a big guy. But I'm sure when he saw the young lion, he thought, oh no, I'm going to get hurt here. I might be able to kill that lion, but I'm probably going to get hurt in the process. You know, no matter how big you are. The term here for young lion didn't mean it was a baby lion. It meant it was a young lion of the pride. In other words, it was at its full maturity, but it wasn't the leader lion, you know, the head. It was a full size, ready to go, mature lion. And he came at Samson. And it's interesting. Samson was not ready for the attack. So God hadn't told him, Samson, I'm going to show you my strength. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do for you. You're going to kill a lion today. No. It was in the surprise. And when that young lion came at him, notice it says, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. Now the Spirit of the Lord had been on him before, but not mightily. And what happened? I mean, I visualize it in my mind. You know, here's this lion, and he takes a big leap, you know, like this. Come on, Samson. And the next thing he knows, Samson just reaches out and grabbed him, ripped him in half, and threw him over to the side. That's what it says. Mm-hmm. Just like you'd rip a goat in half. Well, you don't rip a goat in half. You cut him. Mm-hmm. But Samson, when he got through, it looked like you butchered a goat. He just took the lion, tossed him aside. There's the lion over there. 2 pieces, or, you know, pretty much torn apart with his bare hands. Now, people wonder what was that all about? Well, if you remember, a few years later, a guy by the name of David, when he had to go up against Goliath, what was the thing that made him so acceptable to Saul as the fighter for Israel? Saul said, well, he's just a young guy. You're not even a soldier. And David said, yeah, but I killed a lion and a bear with my bare hands. Now, we know David was not a big guy, because the Bible tells us he wasn't. But he was able to kill the lion and the bear. It was a sign to David and to Israel that this was a special person that God would had his hands on when he needed it. Samson, as far as we know, had never experienced this mighty power of God on him. Wow. And it's interesting, he didn't tell his parents. Now, what would we have done? Man, I'd have come out of that vineyard saying, hey, come on, I want to show you guys something. Look at this. Look what God just did. No, he kept it absolutely quiet. Didn't say a word. This tells me something about Samson that goes probably opposite of what we've always thought about Samson. He wasn't this egotistical guy that thought he was so good. Even in the Bible stories, they have him slick back hair, and hanging, and he's walking around like he's king of the... No, I don't think Samson was that way at all. And here, I think it's just, it was just something God did for him. Why should I tell anybody else? I'm not going to say anything. And so he didn't, and they went on to the town of Timnah. And he talked to the woman, and when he got through talking to her, so evidently he never even talked to her. He just saw her. And after he communicated with her and talked to her for a while, he was even more convinced, this is the one. This is the one that'll fit my plan. This is going to work. This is going to work. All right. Judges 14, starting with verse 8. After some time, when he came to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. He took some of it in his hands and went along eating. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. All right. So after he talked to the woman, they'd gone back to their home, Zorah. They were back in Zorah. And it was some time before he came back to Timnah to get his wife. Now in those days, like I said, the bride stayed with her father, and the son went home. And when he was ready to go get her, when the dowry had been paid and everything was ready, then he would go to the town, again with his parents, and they would have a big celebration, and they would have a feast, and we'll read about that. They would do all of these things, and then he would take his wife, who was now officially married to his wife, and now they could officially be living together as man and wife, and they would go home. Now this period would go anywhere from a few weeks to a year or more, depending on how long it took to prepare everything. And I'm just going to throw in here, think about Jesus. He left how many thousand years ago? What kind of a place is he fixing for us? It took him this long. And he's God. Anyway, throw that out there. So they went to get him. Now on the way, he went back to where that carcass was. And here is this carcass with a bee nest or bee hive in it. Now this tells us something. Number one, bees will not go into a carcass that has flesh on it. Flesh, the smell of rotting flesh. Bees aren't going to go around that. That is repulsive to them. They will, however, go into a skull or a set of bones that is free of flesh. So that tells us this lion has been laying out there for some time. Enough so that between the heat, the bugs, the birds, and all of that, all the flesh had been picked off of the bones, and this was now a pile of bones that had once been the lion.
Oh.
Okay? So in this, the bees came and they set up their home and they built a nest in there, and they had honey. And so Samson came by to check on his lion carcass. That thing's still alive. Look at that thing again. You know, but this tells us God has done something mightily for us. We need to go back and visit that every once in a while. Look what God did for me last year. I'm going back to Timnah. I'm going back to our enemy's town, and look what God did for me last year. He's going to do it for me again if I need it. He's there with me. Samson may never have had to use that extraordinary power of God since the killing of the lion. We don't know. But he went by and he saw this honey. So he went over and he went in there and he got a big glob of that honeycomb. Big piece of honeycomb. And he went out and he gave it to his folks. He didn't tell them where he got it. Now right off the bat, people begin to question about Samson, because one of the things that he was not allowed to do was to touch any dead thing. That was part of the Nazirite vow. They were not allowed to do that. However, there were exceptions. This would have been what is called a legal transgression. And there were times in the law when you could touch a dead animal without being unclean. For instance, if you know, you're there and an animal falls over dead on somebody and is crushing them, you can move the animal and you're not considered unclean. Or if you needed to move an animal or get close or touch an animal in order to get food, it was not unclean. Now, in today's, the way the Orthodox Jews have changed this, you can't even walk on a grave. If you don't know, even if you don't know it's there, if you do, you're unclean. Well, that was never part of the original law. They've taken it so far out there. So this would have been considered a legal transgression. And he didn't tell his parents where it came from. They still didn't know about the lion. They didn't know the honey that they were eating had come from a lion that Samson had killed last year. Would they have even eaten it? And they're like, you gotta be kidding me. No. Kept it quiet. All right. Verses 10 to 15. Now Samson comes into Timnah, and he put a feast on. All right. So his father went down to the woman, and Samson gave a feast there for the young men. Used to do so. In other words, that's what they did as a custom. And it happened when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him. Then Samson said to them, "Let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing." And they said to him, "Pose your riddle that we may hear it." So he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet." Now for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. So it came to pass on the 7th day that they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? All right, so here's what's going on here. The father goes to the father of the bride and the wife. And so the father is meeting with the wife and her father, and they're finishing the negotiations. They're completing all the transactions. Meanwhile, Samson, he throws a big feast, and this was what they did. So evidently we know Samson came from a probably very wealthy family. He threw this big feast. Now, when they, which means the people of the town of Timnah, when they saw Samson, they went out and got 30 guys to come over and be his companions. Now that was something that was normal sort of in those days. You know, if you were having a feast and the bridegroom showed up and he didn't have a wedding party with him, well then you supplied it. You sent people over there. In this particular case, these guys weren't there to be really part of his wedding party. That was the, you know, the obvious part of it. What they were really there for was to keep their eye on Samson. I mean, that's our enemy, whether we're getting along or not. And this guy walks in that looks like, you know, a moving, I don't know, apartment building. I mean, he's big. You know, he's big. You know, big, strong. And he comes into town, and so just to be on the safe side, we're going to have 30 guys there just in case we have some problems. They'll be able to subdue him, take care of, you know, any situation. So you can think of him as a security detail for the town. Now Samson was not stupid. By any range of the imagination, Samson was not stupid. And he knew exactly what was going on. And of course, this was part of his plan. You see, God led him along the way. He brought the lion so Samson could kill the lion. He put the bees in the carcass of the lion so that Samson would have a riddle that would be virtually impossible to figure out. Because nobody knew about the lion and the honey. He didn't even tell his parents. Nobody knew about this except Samson. How would you ever be able to figure out that there was a lion and out of the lion came honey? I mean, how would you ever figure that out? So he poses this riddle. Now, riddles were something that was normal in those days. It's something they did at feasts. It was kind of an amusement thing. You know, we get together and have parties and stuff, you know, and we play charades or I don't know, what else? With apples to apples, that's fun. We used to play all the time, you know, or we play Uno or something. We have games that we play. In those days, riddles were the big thing. And so somebody would pose a riddle and everybody would try to figure the riddle out. And they usually had awards, you know, or prizes if you could figure it out. So it was not unusual for Samson to pose a riddle. So he told him, he said, look, here's the riddle, you know. And so he gave him the riddle. And he said, now, if you can guess that riddle within 7 days, from the start of the feast until the end of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen shirts, which were very costly shirts in those days. It was the inner shirt that they wore. I'll give you 30 of those, and I'll give you 30 changes of clothing, which is the outer garments that you wore over this shirt. But if you can't, you have to give me 30 of each. Now this was this would have been a very high sum of money that would have been needed to purchase 30 sets of clothing and 30 linen shirts. And so they worked at it, and after 3 days, they could not come up with it, didn't understand it, and so they came to Samson's wife. And they didn't just ask her to get the answer. They basically said, if you don't get the answer for us by the 7th day, we're going to burn you and your parents. We're going to kill all of you. Now that, as we learned last week, that was a kind of the accepted method of capital punishment, one of the accepted methods. And the reason that they did, threatened her with this, is because they said, you brought us down here for the express reason of taking our riches away from us, or what we have, because that's what it's going to cost. If we can't figure this out, we're going to have to pay all of that. And you figured this out. You're in cohorts with Samson, and so you're to blame, and so we're going to kill you. Wow, that's a pretty hefty threat to put on her. Now, it also, by the way, this deal with the lion and the bees could also have been a example or a metaphor, or what is another word for it? Anyway, of the idea that the Philistines, who were the stronger, if it had been a normal man, the lion would have killed the man. They would have been the stronger. But in this case, the man defeated the lion. And so this was a sign, perhaps, that the Philistines, who were the larger, would be destroyed by the lesser. And from that would come sweetness. That's just some of the commentaries point that out, that was a possibility. There's nothing in Scripture that, wants that. Just an idea. All right. So, Judges. We're going to go to verses 16. Then Samson's wife wept on him and said, you only hate me. You do not love me. You have posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you have not explained it to me. And he said to her, look, I have not explained it to my father or my mother, so should I explain it to you? Now she had wept on him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it happened on the 7th day that he told her, because she pressed him so much. Then she explained the riddle to the sons of the people. So the men of the city came to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, and they said, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Couple of things to notice here. First of all, she'd been weeping on him every day of the feast. Now, it says 7 days, but commentaries usually say it was probably after the 3rd day that she may have been bugging him from day one about giving the, what is that riddle you gave these guys? What's the answer? But after the 3rd day, when they threatened her, then she was weeping, she was crying, as well she should. I mean, if she doesn't get it, she's going to die along with her family. Now, this is a big deal. And Samson did not tell her anything until the 7th day. But notice something. She said, you only hate me. You do not love me. Now, how is Samson supposed to answer that? He didn't select her because he loved her. He didn't select her even because he wanted her. He selected her because she fit his purpose. Now, normally, if in that situation, the bridegroom would say, oh, well, yes, I do love you, and, No, Samson doesn't say that. Notice what his answer is. He says, I haven't even told my father and mother. Assumption. I love my father and mother, and I haven't told them. I love my father and mother more than I love you because I've been with them longer, that kind of thing. And I haven't even told them. Why do you think I should tell you? You see, his answer was very crafty. It did not put him, the question put him in a very awkward position. Was he going to admit that he didn't love her? Or was he going to admit, or was he going to lie and say, well, yeah, I do love you, Or was he going to come up with something else? And he took the third option. He came up with an answer that did not offend her or say, hey, I don't really love you. And at the same time, it didn't give any indication that he did love her. So that question was nullified by an answer that merely said, I haven't told them, and you can assume I love them. So on the seventh day, finally he gave in. Now, I don't think he was coerced. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He waited until the seventh day. He wanted to put them in as much misery as he could. So he gave her the answer, and of course she immediately went to them. And they came to Samson with the answer. They probably, now notice the way that they couched this. The answer was really, it sounded like they'd figured it out. What sweetness? Well, what's more sweeter than honey? Yeah, must be honey. And what's stronger than a lion? Oh, it must be honey and lion. They didn't say that out of the carcass of a lion came this sweetness. They didn't tell Samson, or divulge the fact that they knew that he killed the lion and out of the lion came the honey. They just said the lion is strength and the honey is sweetness. And he accepted that as the answer to the riddle. He didn't have to accept that. It merely identified two parts of his riddle. They didn't actually tell him, this is how sweetness comes out of strength. He was satisfied that they had told him the riddle with just those two. Okay? Because he had a plan. And notice what he said to them. If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Yeah. Now the plowing of the heifer is kind of interesting. What that alludes to is that in those days they would plow with the oxen, or the heifer would be the female ox. If you hadn't have used my oxen, to get what you wanted, if you hadn't have gone to my wife and got her to tell you the answer, if you hadn't have used my heifer to get what you wanted, you would have never guessed it. And I can see those 30 guys as all of a sudden they say, oh, uh-oh, we might be in trouble here. We just in trouble. All right, let's go to verse 19. And we'll see what Samson did about this. Verse 19, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily. Again, mightily. And he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back to his father's house, and Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So what does Samson do? Now, when we first look at this, we say, why in the world would Samson go down to Ashkelon, which was about 10, 15 miles toward the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, it was right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Ashkelon was one of the main cities of the Philistines. He went down there and killed 30 men. Well, number one, the reason is because God told him to. The Spirit of the Lord came on him. Go down to Ashkelon and take care of the problem. Now, there are some other reasons. He brought those clothes back to Timnah and gave them to the 30 men. He fulfilled his end of the bargain. But it cost the Philistines 30 men. Now, he could have killed the men right there in Timnah.
Yeah.
He could have just wiped them out. They were really the problem. But that would have caused some problems. Number one, that was his wife. And so he had to think about her and her father's house. Also, these two villages were at peace with each other at this point. And was that enough to stir up that conflict between these two local towns? No, probably not. Would it be worth it? You know, Israel would have come against him probably for doing that at that point. And we're going to see that. That's exactly what happens later. So his best point was to go down to Ascalon, because that was a Philistine city. That was one of the main ones. And go down there and kill 30 men and take all of their garments and bring them back and give them to these 30 guys that had been sent there to watch him. And that's what he did. You know, it's something that we don't probably catch, and we may not understand. Why in the world would he do that? But remember, the Spirit of the Lord came on him. And what he had done now is he's got the Philistines, not just this little town, but the Philistines, the whole nation of the Philistines, or their whole group, is now going to be upset at him. But at the same time, they're going to understand that one man walked into Ashkelon and killed 30. Do we really want to go after this guy? You know, so he was setting the example, and he was setting a trap. All right. So now let's move on. Judges chapter 15, beginning with verse 1.
What about the bottom part?
What's that?
Samson's wife was given to his companion.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. I should have mentioned that. As I mentioned, you know, that you were not really completely married until you came and got your wife, right?
Right.
And so what happened was, in the time that he was gone, or even probably before he left, the father decided to give to somebody else. And the only way that could happen is they had to go back through the process again. And it happened to be the man that Samson had selected as his best man. Now that may not have been anybody he even knew. I don't know. It may have just been somebody, one of the 30 men, or it could have been somebody he brought with him. May have been another Israelite. We don't know. But the father decided, well, I'm going to talk to this other guy's father, and we'll make a deal and a dowry, and she'll be given to this other guy. Yeah.
What about the dowry from Samson?
Samson's father had paid the initial dowry.
Yeah.
They were ready to go with this thing and finish it off. So there had been stuff paid, all the negotiations had been met, and her father decided to do something else. Now, we've seen this before, haven't we? You remember Jacob? Mm-hmm. He worked for Laban.
Yeah, yeah.
He made all the arrangements, yeah, and worked for 7 years for Rachel. And then when it came time for the wedding, she was under a veil, and it turns out it was Leah. Oh, well, you know, 7 more years and you can have Rachel. Same thing here. Same thing here. All right, let's see what happens in chapter 15, beginning with verse 1. After a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it happens that Samson visited his wife with a young goat, and he said, "Let me go into my wife, into her room." But her father would not permit him to go in. And her father said, "I really thought that you thoroughly hated her, therefore I am your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead." That sounds just like Laban, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing. And Samson said to them, "This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them." Then Samson went out, caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. Then when he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and olive groves. Then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire.
Yeah.
So here's Samson. Now, he had been at home for some time. Maybe another year. Because it was again harvest time. That would have been the heat of the summer again. So this kind of indicates that this had been maybe a year since he'd been back down to Timnah. And so he decides it's time to go down and claim his wife. So he takes a lamb, or not a lamb, but a goat, with him as an offering or as a present. And he goes down to Timnah, or to the father of his wife, and says, I want to go in and see my wife in the, what would have been the women's apartments or women's. This would be like a harem, a situation where all the women stayed. And his father says, no, you can't do that. And I'm sure Samson says, oh, and why not? Well, because I've given him to her, to somebody else. Somebody else is now paying the dowry. Somebody else is doing all of this. Oh, that was a big mistake. Part or all of the dowry had already been paid by Samson's father.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was a violation not only of law, but of also of the cultures of those days. Even the Philistines recognized that when you had paid your dowry, that was your wife. Now, here's something we have to remember. Everything that Samson did, he did in the office of a judge. Now, he killed 30 men, but remember, it was in response to what the men of the city had done in violating the customs and laws of those days. They had no business talking to his wife. So Samson had every right to punish them. Now, he could have punished them, but he chose to punish 30 others and give the stuff to them. But he was in the act of a judge. He judged whether it was right or wrong. Here we have the same situation, or not the same situation, but another type situation. Her father had violated the customs and laws of their day. She had violated the customs and laws by giving the men that was private information. Today we'd say, oh, that's a violation of security. You know, we have a security violation. Anyway. So he again acted in the capacity of a judge. Now, how did he decide to do this? Number one, I think the Spirit of the Lord had to have come on him again. I don't know anybody that can catch 30 foxes. That's a little tough. Remember also that even though the marriage had not been completed, she was still considered his wife. So her father had violated the marital laws also. Offering, by the way, or the offer of his wife's sister was not only an insult, but it was also would have been a violation of the law. According to Leviticus 18 and 18, you could not take the sister of your wife. That was a violation of the law. It was his wife, and whether anybody liked it or not, he had paid the dowry, they had done everything they needed to do. That was his wife. Whether they were in the same tent or not, it didn't matter. That was his wife. So he was not allowed by law to take the younger sister. Now, he makes an interesting statement. He says in verse 3, "This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them." So what he's saying is there could have been some blame to him for selecting the 30 men of Ascalon over the 30 men of Timnah and substituting this term. But this time he says, I will be absolutely blameless. Under the law, nobody can blame me, because I am going to act in the place of a judge, and I'm going to I'm going to put judgment out on this town because of what they have done. Remember, the 30 men originally were at the wedding because the townspeople sent them. He didn't ask for them. They appointed them to be there. And it was through their violation of the marital laws that this whole thing came about. So the town was technically at fault for this whole situation. So what did he do? Well, he went out into the fields and he caught these 300 foxes. Now the foxes were jackals. Jackals. A jackal is a cross, or it's in between, I guess, a fox and a wolf. And they roam very freely in the mountains areas there in that part of Israel. In those days, of course, they were very, very prominent. I mean, they would run in huge packs or herds of these jackals. So you might see a herd of 100 jackals or more in one herd. And they roam through that whole area down there. And so really it wouldn't have been too hard for Samson to catch 300 of them, especially if he had some help. We don't know. Now he may have run around and caught them. Maybe the Lord gave him the spirit of speed and he could outrun them. I don't know. I don't know how he got them. But he managed to catch all of these jackals. And he took them all together. He had 300 of them. And he took two at a time, and he put a torch between their tails. Now the word torch here means a match or a slow burning, like a candle, or it wouldn't have been a candle, it would have been a torch, probably out of maybe wet or moist hemp or fiber of some kind. And he made these torches, he put them between their tails. And then he took them out, and he went to where the fields were, where they had their grain already brought in, and there was still some to bring in. And he took these 300, and I can see him, he'd light one torch on fire, and he'd let these two foxes, and he'd go over here, and he'd do it again. And when he got through these foxes, you can imagine these foxes. Now, the fire, they're trying to get away from the fire, but their tails are tied together. Can you imagine what those things were doing? They had to have been swinging sideways down and rolling in the hay, trying to get away from this fire. And all they were really doing was igniting all the fields. This was a hot, dry season, and this stuff was extremely flammable. And they went down through there, and when they got through, they had a real fire going. And when the fire got through, it not only burned all of the grain, but it went over into the vineyards. And it destroyed the vineyards. It destroyed the olive trees. Now this last year we had a big fire in California. And that fire, the territory down, I lived in the town that was almost completely destroyed. I lived there for a couple of years, Paradise, California. And the territory around there is very, very similar to what we see in Israel. There are some big trees, but further up, Paradise itself had big trees. But the fire had to burn a lot before it ever got there. Very hot, brushy territory, not a lot of big trees and stuff down there. It burned down through all of that, and then it got up to where the trees were. And that's what happened here. Samson virtually destroyed their entire food chain for that area around Timnah. That was a big loss. Now the grain, next year they could resow the grain and that would come out, and they'd have more grain. But it takes 7 years to produce acceptable grapes. And when it comes to olive trees will start bearing some olives, but you're not going to get a harvest off of those for several years until they get big enough to really produce. And so he really put a dent in the economics of Timnah. Was the cost of the 30 shirts and 30 garments worth it? Was whatever Timnah's father got in an additional dowry worth it? So he burned everything down. It's also interesting to note, the very thing that Samson's wife feared and tried to avoid, which was being burned by fire, ended up happened to her anyway.
Yeah.
You can't run away, or you can't avoid punishment or judgment by doing something else that's just as bad or worse. It doesn't work. All right. Verses 15. Chapter 15, verses 7 and 8. Samson said to them, since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that, oops, I'm sorry, I missed something here. Hold on a minute. Ah, yes. Figure out where I'm at here. Oh yes, okay, so the Philistines came up and burned her and her father and their house, burned them. So Samson then went to them, or talked to them, or sent word. He says, since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease. So I'm going to avenge my wife. You killed my wife and her father and burned down his house. I am going to avenge her death. So he attacked them, hip and thigh, with a great slaughter. Then he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Edom. Again, here he was acting, in this case, he was acting in two positions. One, personally, he was injured by the actions of the people of the town of Timnah. He was personally injured because it was his wife that they killed. Rightly or wrongly, that was his wife. Secondly, he acted as the judge. What you did was wrong, it was illegal, both culturally and by the law, and so I am now going to take judgment out on you. So what did he do? It says, and he attacked them. And this is an interesting point. Hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Now I read one commentary, sometimes I laugh when I read some of these commentaries that, these guys have been around, they were writing in the 1800s, some of them 1700s, some of them later. But he said, well, the hip and thigh meant that he kicked them to death. He used his hip and his thigh, and he kicked them to death. I thought, what? I heard some pretty dumb ones, but that one I had to really chuckle. And I use this guy all the time. I mean, he has some really good things, if you stick with his definitions of Greek and some of these things. But this time he was really out there, and I don't know where he was at. But what this seems to indicate, and the origin of the idea of hip and thigh, we don't really know where it started. But the idea seems to be that if you take a piece of meat, what are the choice pieces of a piece of meat? It's the butt area, and it's the shoulder area. The hip and the thigh. Hip and thigh. This would be considered the thigh on a horse or whatever. It would be this area up here. And this could be considered the butt area or the hip. Or you could change the two, either, however you want to look at it. But that's kind of what they think this was really referring to. The choice. In other words, he killed not only the soldiers or the men that would come against him with armaments, but he also killed the choice, the leaders, the princes. And he wiped them all out. Now, we don't know how many, it doesn't say. But it said he was going to judge until he decided to stop. And when he decided to stop, he would stop. That's what this means.
Okay.
So he destroyed them, hip and thigh. He took out everybody that was of any importance, the best of the town, which tells me he didn't bother the poor. He didn't go out and just kill the guy walking down the street. He picked and chose the best, and he killed them. And when he had finished, he went to Edom, in the cliffs of Edom. Now, Edom, I want to read this to you. Edom was a few miles southeast of Zorah. And not that far, not really that far. And this is all happening in an area not far from Bethlehem and Jerusalem. It's east toward the sea. And this was probably an area that Samson knew well, because as a young man, he probably went down there, even as well, probably not a little child, but as a teenager. He probably did a lot of exploring in that area. You know how kids are. They want to get out and explore things. This would be an interesting area to explore, was the area around Edom. So let me read this to you. Edom, or the rock, is now Bet Arab, a steep, stony bore knoll, standing amidst the winding, narrow valleys, without a blade of grain on its side, but olive groves at its feet, and 3 abundant springs. This answers to Edom, which was large enough for 3,000 men of Judah, and we'll read about that here in a minute, to go up to its top. It is not far from Manoah's paternity, where Noah lived. Where Manoah lived. That's the best way to put that. I can't pronounce it anyway. From whence Samson went down to it. So it was south of Zorah, where he lived. Lower than Esau, toward the south, yet conspicuous from more than one side. Into a cleft of it, Samson retired after slaying the Philistines for burning the Timnite woman who was to have been his wife. In Judah, with Lehi, or Escalon, at its foot. Probably near the city Etam. Probably. Distance enough from Tinmouth to seem a safe retreat for Samson from the Philistines' revenge, yet not too far for them to reach in searching after him. The many springs and rocky eminences around Urtis seem the likely spot where to find the rock of Edom, and the Inhakor, or Condor, in identifying Edom with Beth Atop, says that Edom, meaning Hebrew cleft, answers to the singular rock tunnel, roughly hewn in the stone and running from the midst of the village eastward to the chief spring. This cavern, which is called the place of refuge, is 250 feet long and from 5 to 8 feet high and 18 feet wide. This place was secluded enough that the Jewish towns would be safe from any Philistine looking for him, and yet close enough that he would be found. So, what it means was that southeast of his place where he lived, there was this rocky prominence, and in that was a tunnel that had been hewn out in order to be an aqueduct to carry water from the springs, the chief spring in there, out through the mountain and to the valley into the city. And it was probably this area that he went to. It would be an ideal fortress. If he wanted to stop anybody from finding him, it would kind of be like David when he was running an into there. We've been to the caves and looked up there, and they couldn't find him. So many caves, so many places to hide. It would be that same thing here. Very difficult to find him. And yet it was far enough away that it gave him time, and yet it was close enough that they'd eventually find him. So again, part of his plan. He could have just taken off. He could have went. He could have went anywhere. He could have went on the other side of Jordan. He could have went over to Manasseh. He could have went anywhere. and been protected even. But no, he went to Edom. And there he just stayed in the rocks and the clefts of Edom and basically waited for them to come after him. All right, let's move on to verse 19. Verse 9 to 13. Now the Philistines went up, encamped in Judah, and deployed themselves against Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" So they answered, "We have come up to arrest Samson, to do to him as he has done to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." But they said to him, "We have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines." Then Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves." So they spoke to him, saying, "No, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you." And they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. All right. So here we have Samson in the rocks, and the men, the army of the Philistines, comes over and they encamped at the base of this rocky area in a place called Lehi. Now, the Israelites evidently had their army, 3,000 men, went out to meet the Philistines. And they said, "Why are you here? Why is your army coming over here in our territory?" And they said, "Because we're going here to arrest Samson." In other words, we're not here to attack you. We're not here to do battle. We're not here. We just came to arrest Samson. Now today, this very same thing happens all the time, isn't it? When we have somebody who's a criminal and they flee into Canada, for instance, now we're not going to go over to Canada and fight Canadian forces in order to bring this guy back. But we are going to let them know that we are going to arrest this guy. And so what happens? Same thing that happened here. They say, "You stay down there, we'll go get him for you." All right? Now this served several purposes. If they had have let the Philistines go up into those rocks, they would have known what's up there. And how, this was a fortress area. You didn't want the enemy going up around there and knowing what's there. And secondly, if they had allowed them to do that, then what would stop them from just moving on down and starting to take, on the rest of the cities? So they thought the best thing to do is, we'll go get him ourselves and bring him down. That way, that will placate the Philistines. Show that we're not part of this whole thing, and we're willing to go get him, give it to him. That'll appease the Philistines, and they won't bother us. It was back to this same old thing again. Well, we don't want to make any waves. Let's just keep things the way they are. If we have to sacrifice our champion, so be it. We don't want any problems. So what they do, they went up into the mountains and they found Samson up there. 3,000 Israelites. For one thing, this tells me what they thought about Samson. They didn't send a couple of guys up there to arrest him. They sent 3,000 against Samson. I mean, one guy, come on. Tells me he had quite a reputation.
Yeah.
So they went up there and they talked to Samson, and his only demand of them, he said, "Don't you kill me. If I allow you to take me, don't kill me." Why was that so important to Samson? He was a judge. He was a deliverer of Israel. He was not there to judge Israel. If he was there to judge Israel, and I'm talking about to bring judgment on them, he could have said, "Bring it on, boys." The Spirit of the Lord would have come out of him, and the bodies would have come flying out of Edom.
Yeah.
You see? He wasn't there to judge Israel in terms of bringing judgment on them. That wasn't his position. He was there to judge the Philistines. And so he did not want to hurt anybody any of the Israelites. If they had tried to kill him, this is the thing you have to kind of think about. What would have happened if they had attacked him? We saw what happened to the lion. The Spirit of the Lord came on him mightily. If they had tried to kill him, would the Spirit of the Lord have come on him mightily? Probably so, because they had no reason to harm Samson. They would have been then in violation of the law, and Samson would have had every right to put judgment on them. We start to see a little different picture of Samson, don't we? Rather than the carefree guy that was, a spoiled little brat. No, Samson was he knew what his position was. He knew what his job was. So what did he do? He allowed himself to be captured. And they took him and bound him with 2 new ropes. And of course their assumption was, by binding his hands with 2 new ropes, there's no way he's going to break that. All right, so here they go. They're down the mountain, 3,000 soldiers. Here's Samson walking along, tied up with 2 brand new ropes. Judges chapter 15, beginning with verse 14. Then he came to Lehi. The Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called the place Ramath Lehi. Talk about a plan going awry. These Philistines had no idea what was going to happen. Now, as soon as he got down to Lehi, now by the way, Lehi means jawbone.
Oh.
It means jawbone. It was a very rocky kind of an area. As I say, it was at the base of Etam, where these caves were and things. And it probably had, to somebody, the look of a jawbone. That's the way we do things today. There's arrowhead. Well, it looks kind of like an arrowhead or something. So we kind of imagine things and we give things names. Well, that was kind of what it was here. But it was also, I personally feel, that Samson knew exactly what was going to happen. And that he knew that jawbone was going to be there. Because God had installed in him a plan. And when God puts a plan together, it's detailed. God never halfway does things. So Samson knew what was going to happen. And when he got down from Etam, and he got into Lehi, where these guys were, they started shouting, and they started jumping up and down and hooting and hollering. They were now going to get vengeance, and here they come, at least 1,000 of them. We don't know if there were more that escaped before he could get to them. We don't know. But here they came at him, thinking he's bound up and we're just going to tear him apart. Swords drawn, hooting and hollering, and here they come. What they didn't count on was the Spirit of the Lord. When the Spirit of the Lord comes, nobody can stand against you. I don't care how many, I don't care how big, I don't care how well armed, they cannot stand against you. One man, one person. And Gideon, he just took and popped off the ropes, picked up the jawbone, and when he got through, there were 1,000 dead.
Not Gideon.
Huh?
Samson.
Samson.
You said Gideon.
Oh, I like Gideon.
I know you do.
Sorry
Yes,
about
you do.
that. I'm still from yesterday. No, it was Samson. Samson, he's the guy that got the
Yeah,
job.
that's the guy.
And when he got through, there were 1,000 soldiers stacked up all around him. And he had a new jawbone. Why was it new? Because if it was an old sun-bleached jawbone, it wouldn't last long enough for him to kill everybody before it would break.
Yeah.
He needed a fresh one. He needed one that was still strong. Now, to me, a jawbone is probably one of the worst things you'd want to try to use for a weapon. To me, I mean, it's not that they were probably, they're big donkeys over there. So I mean, it was probably pretty good size. But still, I'd want a stick. I'd want something else. Something heavy. Not a jawbone. I mean, that's awkward. How in the world would you? What would you do? I don't know. But he used it, and when he got through, they were all dead.
1,000 of them.
And when he had killed 1,000 men, now some of them probably escaped, because even though he was mighty, you're taking care of 1,000 men. If there's 3,000 men there, where are they going to go? I mean, you can't keep up with them. They're going to go. So there was probably a lot that got away, and they were able to tell the story. My question is, what were the 3,000 Israelites doing?
Oh.
You had 3,000 soldiers there. And here's Samson with a jawbone, and he's taken on 1,000 Philistines. And I don't read that not one of those soldiers got in the fight. They probably ran away.
Yeah, they probably ran.
They probably thought Samson was going to take them on next. It's interesting that even today, Christians, some Christians, when there is a battle, they run. When somebody does stand up and say, no, you can't do that. You can't trample my rights as a Christian. Half the churches seem to say, well, sit down and behave yourself because they're going to come worse. Oh, you're just one of those fanatics. Quit being so fanatical. Isn't that right? Yeah. And they call themselves Christians. Sorry. They disqualify themselves. If they're not radical, if they're not fanatical, they're not following Jesus. Because Jesus was radical. Jesus was fanatical. He taught sin is sin.
Yeah.
Right? If we're not doing that, how can we call ourselves followers of Him? Now, I admit there's some that really get fanatical, and I'm not talking about church doctrines. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about is how we treat the world. How do we differentiate sin from Christianity? All right, gotta hurry. All right, so after he got through, he sang this little song, or wrote this little poem, or whatever, and it's actually in the form of a riddle, which was, again, Samson's thing. He said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. In those days, it was customary that when you had a great victory, you sang a song, or you wrote a poem, or you came up with something. And we see that in all kinds of different situations. Judges 5:1, Exodus 15:1, 1 Samuel 18:6-7 were just a few examples. You remember when Deborah, after the victory, what they do? They sang the song of Deborah and Balak. So there was a victory song, and that's what he was doing here. So he has this song, and the way he did things, it was more in the form of a riddle. And when he finished off, he threw down that jawbone. All right, finally, verses 18-20. Then he became very thirsty. So he cried out to the Lord and said, you have given this great deliverance by my hand of your servant, by the hand of your servant. And now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called the name in Hochor, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 days in the days of the Philistines.
Years.
20 years.
Yeah, man. I'm getting old, I can't even read. All right, so after he had finished the battle, he threw down the jawbone. Now remember, it was hot. It was hot. It was extremely hot. He's up in the rocks. He's just killed 1,000 men with a jawbone. Now I'm sure he didn't do that in 3 minutes. It had to be a long battle. Took a long time, even at best, even if he never was hurt, even if he was never touched, it would have been a long time in the heat, swinging this heavy jawbone and killing all of these soldiers. And so he was thirsty. And it was, and the way this is, the phrasing behind all of this, seems to indicate that he thought he was going to faint and possibly die from heat exhaustion. We'd say today it was heat exhaustion. Sure, you're out there in the hot sun and you're pounding on these guys for no telling how long. And so he knew he was in trouble. He had to have some water. Now I've heard preachers say, well, he was just spoiled, you know, he just wanted something right now. No, I think he was in a position where he was in trouble.
Yeah.
Now he could have gone back up into Edom where the springs were. But was he physically capable? After the Spirit of the Lord had lifted from him, he's just he's exhausted.
Yeah.
So what does he do? He does what he should do.
Cry out to the Lord.
He cried out to God, but I want you to notice what he said. First of all, he acknowledged that God had given him the victory. Again, we think about Samson as being egotistical, but Samson said, you have delivered them into my hands. So he gives God all the credit. He then asked God if he should die as a result of this battle. Should I die? How shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? The third thing was it God's will that he fall into the hands of the Philistines? Should I faint? Really, the word here more is faint than die. Should I faint and the Philistines come back and get me? Is that your will? Is that what you want? See, he wasn't demanding water. He was pointing out to God, you brought me the victory. Now, do you want me to die? Do you want the Philistines to capture me? It was more, what do you want now out of me? He was putting himself in the hands of God. And what did God do? Well, number one, he will always provide rest when anyone does his work. So there was a place, this place they were at was near Eleutheropolis. In the time of Jerome, that was called Samson's Spring. In other words, this place where Samson was, he asked God, he needed water, he needed hydration. And so what God did is he took and he divided, or he broke open, and actually what this means is he scooped out a mortar. You know, when you have spices, you have a pestle and mortar. The word there actually means a mortar, or a hollow out. And so God actually carved out a hollow place in the rock and opened it up, and it filled with water so he could be refreshed. You say, well, that's kind of far-fetched. Oh yeah? We've already talked about angels coming, fire coming out of rocks, devouring sacrifices. We talked about the angel of the Lord going up in the fire, you know, and then rocks splitting open and water coming out of them for Moses. I mean, no, this was not something unusual for God. There was a need. God supplied the need. No matter where you are, no matter how dry it is, no matter how complicated it might be, God can always meet your need. And it says that place is there till today. And so it was in the time of Jerome that they had that spring in that same area that was called Samson's Spring. A little spring came up and produced water. And by the way, Samson named that place Ramah Lehi, which that was the place where he threw down where he threw down the jawbone, which was the jawbone. This place he named El Horkor, and that means the supplication well. Supplication well, or the spring of one calling. He called on God, and God provided the spring. Now, Samson, he judged Israel for 20 years. Notice it says, while the Philistines, or in the days of the Philistines, God did not allow Samson, or did not use Samson, to completely defeat the Philistines. All the other judges we've covered, Deborah, Gideon, it was a mighty victory, and they drove them out of the land, and whatever. Not in this case. Remember, Israel had not called on God for deliverance. God just suddenly raised up Samson. And so what Samson did is he judged for 20 years. And whenever there was a situation like this one, he was able to step into that situation. Now, because God had done these things for him, he maybe never ever had to do it again until the end of his life. We don't know. The Bible does not give us any examples. But it does say that he judged for the entire 20 years during the times of the Philistines. When the Philistines were still dominant, they were still over the Israelites. And yet Samson was able to be the judge between the Philistines and the Israelites. See, Samson was not just the glory hound, egotistical character that we seem to think that he was. He operated in the will of God in everything that he did. Do you have any questions?
That was a good lesson. Very